It has been a hot minute since I did a best books video. I was doing them every month, but because I'm on deadline at the moment, I decided that I was going to do the entire autumn season all in one go. So today I'm going to share with you my best books from September, October, and November. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sam. I'm a romance author based in the UK. My book, You've Got Chainmail, came out in August. It's a contemporary rom-com with a fantasy twist, but I'm not here to plug my book. I'm here to talk about the books that I have read and loved in the past 3 months. If you're not new around this channel, then you already know I don't do negative reviews on this channel. It just doesn't vibe with me being an author myself, but I do love to talk about the books that I am reading and loving. And so today I have got a top 6 books for you. Technically, I'm doing like a top 5, but one of those 5 is a duology, so it's kind of 6 books. But before I get into my top 5, top 6, whatever, here are all of the books that I picked up in those 3 months. So in September, October, and November of 2024. I also am currently reading 2 that are not here, and that is Sharkheart and Graveyard Shift. And I'm rereading The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon as well, but I've literally just like 20 minutes ago picked that back up. But amongst these 17 books, I did not have a single DNF across those 3 months, which doing something right. I had a few books that I had to take back to the library because I didn't get to them in time. And I do have one book that's not on this list that I started to read, but then pushed to December because it's a Christmas book. But of all 17 of these books that I picked up, I finished them, which is great because usually I would have a few DNFs in there. One of these books, Beach Read, is a reread. So whilst that would probably be my number 1 book, I'm not including it in my top 5 because if you are new here, one thing you'll learn quickly about me is that I am a huge Emily Henry fan, and Beach Read is my favorite of her books. I reread it probably once a year. Of these 17 books that I read, my average rating was 3.5 stars. The lowest was 2 stars. I don't often have 1 star. If there's 1 star, then I probably DNF it unless I was reading it for a book club or a video or something like that. And I didn't have any of those, so 2 was the lowest rating I gave, and I did give some 5-star ratings. But enough about all that. Let's talk about my best books of the autumn season 2024. And I'm so excited because I actually have physical copies of all of these books to hold up so I don't have to source graphics later, which will make editing this a lot easier. So I'm going to talk about this as a top 5 just because I'm going to hold up the duology together. And so it's a lot easier for me to say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So number 5, we have Given Our History by Kristyn J. Miller. This is a second chance romance about Clara, who is an assistant professor on the tenure track. And just as she's starting to go for tenure, who should show up but her childhood best friend / turned something slightly more, Teddy, who is a visiting professor. She has to share an office with him. And as they reconnect, we have this sort of dual timeline where we see what happened between them, I think like 8-10 years ago. And then the main story, which follows them as they are reconnecting and getting to know one another again. It's very autumnal, very academic. I would say it's like light academia. But one of the reasons why I love this book so much is because it's one of the few second chance romances that I've read where the character development between when they split up and when they get back together, which is the hallmark of a second chance romance. It means they used to be together or they had the opportunity to be together, and now the main story is taking place years later when they get a second chance. And sometimes it's not very clear through the narrative how those people have changed in the intervening period. Sometimes it's not clear why they went their separate ways to begin with. And while I don't think that the reasons for having gone separate ways are going to make sense for everyone, I think they will make sense to everyone. I think regardless of how you feel about that, you will understand for those particular characters why that rift happened. And similarly, I think that the character growth that you see in the main story is really evident. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they don't tiptoe around the issue. They act like adults. And I think that that's part of why the character development is so clear, because they are teenagers when they first meet. So you see a really clear difference between the teenagers and then young adults that they are in the earlier timeline versus the fully fledged adults and professionals that they are in the present day timeline. And they still feel like the same characters, but they feel like fully formed versions of themselves, and they communicate as such. And I think that that's really wonderful. I love Teddy and I love Clara, and I think that it's very rare where you find a romance where you like both of the people individually and you like them as a couple and you think that they are better together as a couple. I don't think you always have to. Some of my favorite romances are ones where you don't really like them individually, but you want them to be together. But it's a breath of fresh air when you do have two leads that you like individually and want to be together. So that's Given Our History by Kristyn J. Miller. At number 4, we have The Crimson Moth by Kristen Ciccarelli, and this is called Hunter's Mark. Something different in the US, and I don't really know why, but it's called The Crimson Moth in the UK. And this is a romantasy. It's about Rune, who is like 18, 19 years old, and she spends her days being this like vapid socialite, and she spends her nights as the Crimson Moth, who is a witch helping to liberate other witches. Witchcraft is not allowed in this society. There was a sort of revolution to overthrow the witch queen. I think it was meant to be 2 years before. And during that revolution, Rune actually turned in her grandmother, who's a witch, who told her to do so. You know that kind of from the beginning. Her grandmother told her, you have to turn me in order to save yourself and give them no reason to think that you're also a witch. But some people do think that she might be a witch. One of whom is Gideon, who is Rune's best friend's older brother, and also happens to be part of this sort of military force that are responsible for hunting and capturing witches, containing them, and ultimately executing them. It's a dual POV novel, so we get both Gideon and Rune's perspectives. Rune, as she is trying to balance romancing Gideon as a way to try to get information and protect her identity as the Crimson Moth, and Gideon's perspective as he is romancing Rune, but also trying to find the Crimson Moth and bring her to justice. This book is not perfect. One of the things that really bothered me about this book, and we're going to come to this in another one as well, is the age of Rune, because the whole idea is that it's only been a couple of years since her grandmother had her turn her in, and she's now like a teenager, but she's trying to get married. Like, this is a fantasy world. It would have been very easy to just make her like 3 years older. Make it have been 5 years instead of 2 years. Make her not be a teenager looking to get married and looking to romance this other character. I think that it would have been a little bit more believable, especially as you start to uncover parts of Gideon's backstory. It feels a little bit weird that like they're so young and like what is the age gap? So there are some considerations there that I don't love, and I just think it would have been really easy to do that in a different way. However, I was on the edge of my seat this entire book. I thought it was so interesting. I thought the magic was really cool. I thought the relationship between the two of them felt very romantic, very fraught at the same time. It's this really nice dichotomy of like the hate they have for each other's personas, known and unknown, but the love that's developing between the two of them feeling very real and tender and sweet. I think there are also a few things that I expected to happen in this book that would have made it very, very predictable that were then turned on their heads. And I think one thing that this book does exceptionally well, which I find is so important to really ground the reader in fantasy, is like sensory detail. So what do things feel like? What do they smell like? Not just what they look like. And you really feel like you're right there in the story in this book. I love Gideon. He's fantastic. Please protect him at all costs. And I am so looking forward to the sequel. At number 3, we have the duology, and this is Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. I was going to say that the fact that I hadn't read these books was astounding, but actually until this year, I've not been a huge fantasy reader, not since I was a kid. And so a lot of the big waves of YA fantasy that a lot of people have really enjoyed that sort of happened between Twilight and now, I missed a lot of that. And so while the entire Grishaverse may feel like required reading to a lot of people, for me, it just was never really on my radar. I've been hearing about Six of Crows for years now, but it wasn't until this year, until last month, that I decided to pick it up. I'm just going to hold up Six of Crows because I'm going to talk mostly about that, because Crooked Kingdom is a sequel that takes place in the immediate aftermath of Six of Crows. Six of Crows is a heist novel. It's an urban fantasy, and I think there are 6 different point of view characters. Kaz, Inej, Nina, Matthias, Jesper, and Waylon. Yes, there are 6 point of view characters that have been brought together by this young crime lord named Kaz Brecker to try to pull off a really dangerous heist that could create a really huge payout for all of them. The story takes place mostly in a city called Ketterdam, which kind of has Amsterdam vibes. And Kaz is kind of the second in command to this crime boss. He looks after this particular nest of this gang, I guess. And he assembles this team, which includes your sort of stealthy rogue type person called Inez. She's known as the Wraith. You've got Jesper, who's sort of the sharpshooter. You've got Waylon, who's your scientist. You've got Matthias, who is your sort of fighter, and then you've got Nina, who is your witch. Now, she is what's called a Grisha, which is kind of magic users in this book, but Grishas can do like specialized types of magic. So some people can change the way things look, some people can heal. There are lots of different, I guess, types of magic that Grishas can do. But these 6 team up together to pull off this heist, and a lot of stuff happens along the way. This is very much YA, but it doesn't talk down to the reader. Everything about this feels incredibly thought out, incredibly immersive, incredibly complex. Similar to The Crimson Moth, I have issues with character ages because Kaz Brekker is meant to be 17 years old. And he is not only like this crime boss, which I guess like sure could happen, but he is so wizened that he is constantly one step ahead of things. Like, oh, that happens? Good thing Kaz thought of this ages ago and the reader just didn't know until now. Let me tell you exactly how Kaz set everything up for this particular situation. Like, and it gets more and more ridiculous as time goes on. And yes, there are key moments where Kaz has not prepared for these eventualities, and that is then where the catch is, but it happens so often that it's like, that's not a 17-year-old. That's not a 17-year-old. Some of the things you're talking about needing to have set up, like, have taken him years to achieve. You're telling me he started doing that when he was like 15? And yes, that's in his backstory. He started when he was very young, but like, it just is, it's a little bit ridiculous. It requires a little bit of suspension of disbelief. However, if you can pretend that all of these characters are in their mid to late 20s, this book slaps so hard. You get points of view from all 6 of those characters that I mentioned, and they are all so distinct and so different. I actually listened to this on audio and they all have different narrators, which I don't normally love when there's that many points of view, but it was so good. It's very like dark and shadowy. I don't normally like urban fantasy, but the urban setting really propped up a lot of the kind of seedy feeling of this book. Like I said, Crooked Kingdom picks up right where Six of Crows left off. I actually preferred Crooked Kingdom. I think one, because I was already in the characters' heads and I jumped straight into Crooked Kingdom, but also because I really liked the way Leigh Bardugo wove in a lot of backstory in Crooked Kingdom, because part of Six of Crows, one of the few issues that I had with it was that you didn't necessarily get a ton of backstory about each of the characters because there were so many, and if you had dived into all of their backstories, you wouldn't have had time for the main story. But within Crooked Kingdom, you then get to do that a little bit in a way that supports your understanding of the current story. So I actually preferred Crooked Kingdom, but I really think that they deserve to just be presented as a bundle because that's what they are. These are 2 parts of the same story. Does that make a chunky book? Yes, it does. But I think if you're gonna read Six of Crows, be prepared to devote time to Crooked Kingdom, because if you like Six of Crows, you will love Crooked Kingdom. And really, I just haven't been able to stop thinking about these books since I finished them. Next up at number 2, we have Haunted Ever After by Jen DeLuca. Now, I picked this up because I thought it was going to be autumnal because it's kind of spooky. It's about a haunted town. It was not autumnal. It was actually decidedly summery, but that's okay. I still had a great time with it, as obvious by the fact that it's at number 2. Haunted Ever After is about Cassie and Nick. Cassie has just moved out of her life in Orlando to buy a house in this little town called Boneyard Key, right on the water. She got this gorgeous little cottage. She doesn't really know how she was able to afford it, but she's not looking a gift horse in the mouth, and she has just moved in. But she very quickly notices that something is amiss in her house. The electricity is being really weird, and at one point her fridge magnets start moving around. Meanwhile, there is Nick, who is the owner of the coffee shop down the street, and he is a lifelong resident of Boneyard Key. So he is very comfortable comfortable with the fact that actually this entire town is haunted. And in fact, he has a ghost roommate. So the previous owner of the coffee shop still lingers in the upstairs apartment where Nick now lives and communicates with him via text message a lot of the time while Nick is trying to run the coffee shop. He is getting distracted by this cute girl that keeps coming in to hug his Wi-Fi because her electricity isn't working at home. And the two get to know each other. Cassie's like learning about and trying to understand this idea of things being haunted. There's fun townspeople. There's little summer outings. It's very, very cute. Very great dynamic. Nick and Cassie have very good chemistry together. Of all of the books that like to use Gilmore Girls as a touch point, saying that it's like Gilmore Girls meets whatever else, this book is the closest that I've seen to something that actually resembles Gilmore Girls. Cassie and Nick are definitely giving Lorelai and Luke. Nick is definitely a little bit grumpy and Cassie's your sunshine. But as the two start to get closer, Cassie starts to uncover more about the ghost that is in her house, who lived there before, are there secrets to that story that haven't been told properly in the local history books. And Nick is of course helping her every step of the way, sometimes to his own detriment. Jen DeLuca is very, very good at writing funny books. The characters aren't like making jokes. It's not like Emily Henry super witty banter. It's more just that the story itself is really funny. There was one point where, and this isn't really a spoiler, I'm going to be quite vague, but they're banishing a ghost. And the thing that Cassie says to banish this ghost made me snort laugh so hard that I then had to explain the plot of this entire book to my husband, who was lying in bed next to me, because he so badly wanted to know what was so funny. I also really liked how realistic their romance was. It didn't feel like it ramped up too quickly or like it was too slow to develop. It felt like a very realistic pace for a romance to develop, which I think is hard to do in a way that feels low angst. It's not without its angst. It's obviously, a romance and therefore romantic conflict is going to exist, but it was relatively low angst, and that's hard to do when you're prolonging the getting together part of the romance. There were parts of it that were really touching as well, but at the end of the day, it was just a really good time. It was really fun, really well executed. I loved the spooky vibes. I also love this cover. Anyway, that's Haunted Ever After. And then finally, at number 1, we have A Dark and Secret Magic by Wallace Kinney. This book is about Hecate Goodwin, who is a hedge witch who lives in Massachusetts, I believe. Surprise, surprise. And she is preparing for Samhain, which is Halloween, because her whole coven is going to be coming to her house for the Samhain feast. And it's her first year having to prepare for that on her own because her mother passed away 6 months prior. Also on Samhain, it's her birthday, and specifically, it's a very important birthday within her coven because it's the birthday where they're going to be doing her containment ritual. What that means is that the magic specialty that she chose at age 13, she's going to be kind of locked into that magic, which in theory is going to strengthen the magic that she's chosen because it cuts her off from all other kinds of magic. However, Hecate's situation is a little bit strange because while most witches choose for themselves at age 13 what kind of magic they're going to do, Hecate, who goes by Kate's mother, when she was born, declared to everyone that she was going to be a hedge witch. So Kate didn't get a choice in the matter. As she's preparing for Samhain and her containment, Matthew shows up. And Matthew is from a rival coven from the West Coast, and it has been 10 years since they've seen each other. I think 10 years. They'd hit it off brilliantly 10 years ago, and then Kate's mother banished Matthew, but not before he managed to put a sour taste in her mouth. Now he's back, and he's trying to convince Kate that there's something weird going on with her containment and her training as a hedge witch. And this is starting to be validated by the fact that Kate's learning some weird things about her mother and her powers, and she keeps seeing these strange references to someone called the King Below. So she's trying to figure all of that out. It is a romantasy, so the relationship between Kate and Matthew is very central to the story, but the fantasy elements surrounding it, the familial elements, Kate and her sisters, and all of these women in her coven, it's so strong as well. And while the title I don't feel necessarily suggests it, and while it does get dark, especially towards the end, I actually think I would personally class this as a cozy romantasy because there are a lot of like cozy autumnal Halloween-y kinds of things. Like there's a pumpkin carving contest at one point. And it just feels like cozy and autumnal despite the really high stakes and the slightly darker turn that it takes towards the end. That's not to say that it's like scary or anything because it's not. I listened to this audiobook while I was in the US on my recent trip and I loved it so much that I bought a copy before I came back because I wasn't sure if it had been published in the UK. You can get this same copy in the UK, but I think it's the US version that's basically shipped to the UK. But I loved this book. I loved Matthew. He is one of my favorite romantic heroes that I have read this year. And that's with all of the romance books that I read. I just adore him. The chemistry between him and Kate is brilliant. This is not a spicy book. It's not closed door, but it's not spicy. But the chemistry between them is so strong. I will say the magic and the way that magic is used, what it feels like when it's being used, the kind of sensory and immersive quality to that's definitely a big point of praise for this book. It feels so real and it feels simultaneously very exciting and interesting as a reader, but also so natural and so not out of place in the world that we're reading about. I also really loved getting to see a little taste of all the different types of witchcraft that were available because you have Hecate, who's a hedge witch. Her mother was a kitchen witch. You've got one of her sisters who is she does tarot, so I guess she's clairvoyant. You've got another one who's like a siren, basically. There's a woman who practices metamagic. There's a book witch. There's a time witch. And you see these little tasters of what all these witches are capable of without it feeling like it's overwhelming the relevant story that's happening, but also without it feeling like the author has just invented new types of magic to solve the problem at hand. It all feels very established and grounded within the world. This was a debut novel, and that is wild to me because it was just so well executed. Every single element of it. The magic, well executed. The relationships with the other characters, well executed. The romance, well executed. The setting, well executed. The sort of tension between the different covens, well executed. The balance between understanding the present story and also understanding what happened 10 years ago when they met the first time, well executed. Like everything was just absolutely nailed. I think that Wallace Kinney has done such a brilliant job. I'm very jealous. Imagine having this good of a book be your debut novel. I mean, it's just fantastic. Such a brilliant book. So good. Definitely my favorite fantasy that I've read this year. I could not buy this book fast enough when I finished the audiobook. Definitely my number one. And that is it. Those are my top 5, 6, whatever books of the autumn season. I've got quite an ambitious video schedule for the month of December, so make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss any of those. I know that I've been posting less frequently while I've been on deadline, but I've got a lot more coming your way. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!